Myanmar must prevent genocide against the Rohingya. That's the order from the International Court of Justice. Its judges say Rohingya Muslims there are extremely vulnerable. But will this ruling make a difference, or is it just symbolic? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, has ordered Myanmar's government to prevent its military from committing acts of genocide against the Rohingya.
The Rohingya in Myanmar have been subjected to acts which are capable of affecting their right of existence.
The ICJ has also warned that the Rohingya Muslim minority remain at serious risk of genocide and ordered the country to abide by the Genocide Convention and take all measures within its power to prevent further killings. The case, brought by the Gambia last year, accuses Myanmar of committing an ongoing genocide against its minority Muslim Rohingya population. Myanmar denies the allegations. Thursday's ruling comes just days after an inquiry backed by Myanmar's government dismissed allegations of genocide. Myanmar's de facto civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi says the Rohingya have exaggerated abuses. So what does this ruling mean, and will Myanmar abide by the orders? We'll discuss all this in a moment with our guests, but first, let's take a look at how we got here. It's been more than 2 years since 700,000 Rohingya fled violence in Myanmar. The military launched the crackdown in Rakhine State. The UN later described it as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. According to Doctors Without Borders, at least 6,700 Rohingya, including 730 children under the age of 5, were killed in the first month of the operation. More than 1 million Rohingya are now living in refugee camps in neighboring Bangladesh. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Myanmar has called on the international community to continue to put pressure on Myanmar to follow whatever decisions come from the UN's top court.
The Security Council fails to refer the situation of Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. And I think we must continue to put pressure on the Security Council of its failure to do this. By not referring the situation to ICC, the Security Council is really not fulfilling its obligations and its responsibilities set forth under the UN Charter, etc. I have been stressing setting up an international ad hoc tribunal dedicated to the situation of Myanmar.
All right, let's bring in our guests in London. We have Thomas McManus. He is director of the International State Crime Initiative at Queen Mary University of London. In Chicago, on Skype, we have Azim Ibrahim. He is chair of the Center for Global Policy's Rohingya Legal Forum and author of the book Rohingya Inside Myanmar's Hidden Genocide. And in New York, we have Simon Adams. He is the executive director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, and he has worked with the Gambia on this case. Welcome to you all. Azim, let me start with you. I was struck today by how many Rohingya refugees who are in Bangladesh were posting their reactions on sites like Twitter to the ruling from the International Court of Justice. Now, one person in particular, a writer and poet named Mayu Ali, he wrote, "My Rohingya brothers and sisters, the gate of justice is just opened." So I want to get your reaction to that as somebody who has written extensively for several years about all the persecution faced by the Rohingya. Do you believe that this actually opens the gates for justice going forward so that the Rohingya can finally get some justice for all the abuses and atrocities that they have suffered?
Well, this is without a doubt an unprecedented decision, but we have to put it into context. This is just a decision on preliminary measures in terms of, you could say it's equivalent of a restraining order against a state, that the state has to protect its population from genocide and preserve the evidence. It is not a decision on the actual hearing, which could take many, many years in the making, where the court makes a determination on actual genocide itself. So we have to put that into context. But despite that, this is an unprecedented decision without a doubt. It's actually very unusual, particularly for the court to command Myanmar that they have to report to the ICJ, every 6 months, for example. This has just not happened before. But in terms of the Rohingya, the Rohingya have been described as one of the most persecuted minorities in the world. The genocide against them has been going on for decades upon decades. The majority of their population has been forcibly displaced out of Myanmar. And, many of them have never seen any sort of justice or any sort of accountability in their lifetime. So this decision by the highest court in the world is obviously extremely welcome to them, and hence their excitement.
Thomas, if I could, I saw you nodding, by the way, and if I could ask you to expand a bit on what Azim was saying. I mean, the International Court of Justice, when it all boils down, it has no enforcement power. So can we expect that Myanmar would actually comply or even attempt to comply with this ruling?
Well, I think a gateway to justice is actually a good way of describing today's events. The International Court of Justice is now going to refer the matter to the UN Security Council. And this was a unanimous decision by judges from Myanmar, China, Russia. So at the UN Security Council, it's going to be very difficult for permanent members to veto any action now that their own judges have made this determination. So while we haven't come to any justice as such, what we have done is potentially reach the end of the line for denial by the Burmese Myanmar government about the genocide process, which has been going on for a long, long time, and became much more serious since June 2012. So I think it is a very important step, and it's going to be very difficult now for both the Burmese government to continue with their denial and for other nations to go along with that. Everyone's on notice now. For example, we had a huge investment conference here in London in March last year, run by the British government for investment into Burma, Myanmar. How are they going to be able to do something like that again with this judgment on the table? So the significance is there, that we now have a determination. Preliminary, yes, but we have a determination that there's a case to answer.
Simon, you've worked with the Gambia's Ministry of Justice on this case. Could you explain for our viewers the genesis of this case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, the first thing I'd like to say about that is we should absolutely applaud the Gambia, the tiniest, smallest country in Africa, but is kind of emerging as a giant in the world of human rights now because of the transition from dictatorship to democracy in their own country. And look, any state that is a signatory to the Genocide Convention could have brought this case forward. But we approached a number of governments, ourselves and our partners at the Global Justice Center. Lots of talk, but nobody was willing to take this case forward, except for the Gambia. So I think they upheld their responsibility to protect the Rohingya people. It's a historic case, and I think today was a very bad day for the generals in Myanmar, because in front of the eyes of the world, the previous speakers were right, this is not a final decision, but in front of the eyes of the world, the court issued an order saying that they have to stop acts which could be potential acts of genocide against the Rohingya. And I think it's a very good day for international justice.
Azim, just hours before the ruling was issued, Aung San Suu Kyi, the de facto civilian leader of Myanmar, published an editorial in which she denied, once again, that acts of genocide had taken place. She also said that refugees had exaggerated the extent of the abuses committed against them. So, with what's happened, should we extrapolate this to mean that Aung San Suu Kyi and also the military in Myanmar will continue to just defy international pressure, or will they start coming more in line with the demands being placed on them by bodies like the ICJ?
But it's very difficult to see how they're going to react to this ruling, because this entire process has backfired from what I can see on Aung San Suu Kyi. By appearing in court and addressing the court, she has legitimized the court. Usually in these kinds of situations, when international courts find against individuals or start inquiries against war crimes or genocide, the usual policy is to deny the legitimacy of the court. But Aung San Suu Kyi and Myanmar simply cannot do that anymore. And her central premise, her argument, also backfired. Her argument was that there was no genocide, that there's only war crimes that are being committed, and we can argue and we will take action against that. But the court has decided that those war crimes can turn into genocide hence why they have to take these provisional measures. So, and Aung San Suu Kyi has been going through a process of trying to buy time. She has set up numerous commissions of inquiry of her own. One of them just reported yesterday, which are all just seen as whitewashes. Seen as whitewashes. One of the previous inquiries which Myanmar did, after one of the previous episodes of genocide, the inquiry came to the conclusion that the only crime committed was that a soldier stole a bike. So this is the level of inquiry that they're undertaking, and the court simply did not recognise the fact that Myanmar is going to take any serious action to ameliorate the situation, hence these provisional measures.
Thomas, I myself have made 4 separate reporting trips to Cox's Bazar to report on the plight of the Rohingyas since October of 2017. I was there in 2018 when a UN fact-finding mission came out with a statement in which they urged that generals in Myanmar be prosecuted for genocidal intent. What's happened with the International Court of Justice, does this get us any closer to a day, perhaps, when we would see a particular person or perhaps military leaders actually named in one of these bodies, in one of these forums, and prosecuted, perhaps, for genocidal intent?
Yeah, absolutely. We're much closer now to a punishment phase of international justice. The court today is really concerned with urgent preventative measures. The Genocide Convention covers prevention and punishment. So today they're talking about prevention, and they have released a judgment telling the world that there's a serious risk of genocide. Serious risk is the legal terminology that is used to kick in the obligations to every nation on earth now under the Genocide Convention. So at the moment, today is about prevention, but down the line, we now are looking we can't just leave it at prevention. Punishment will come later on, and I think this case, as is going to go on for another few years now, once we start seeing the evidence coming in, it's going to be very hard for senior members of the Burmese military and senior members of the civilian government to avoid accusations and eventually charges of genocide in an international criminal forum.
Simon, I saw you nodding along with what Thomas was saying, so I want to get your reaction as well. But I also want to bring up the fact that you have the case, of course, in the International Court of Justice. But you also have a case that's going on the International Criminal Court, whereby the judges there have now granted the prosecutor basically the ability to investigate the crimes that have been committed against the Rohingya. So first, if you could talk about what you think as far as what happens next. Are we closer to actually seeing specific people being prosecuted at some point? And beyond that, how does the case or the potential case at the International Criminal Court also play along in bringing pressure to bear on Myanmar and its leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, justice is coming. There's no doubt about that. We see that in the provisional measures ruling that happened today at the International Court of Justice. We see that, as you mentioned, in the fact that the prosecutor is now looking into crimes at the International Criminal Court. We see that even in a universal jurisdiction case that's being put forward in Argentina. And the thing that these cases all have in common is that the world has become a little bit smaller for those generals in Myanmar who thought that they could get away with this crime in front of the eyes of the world, and that no one would speak up for the Rohingya, that nobody would do anything, that nobody would come to their assistance or aid or dare to speak on their behalf. So I think that's what they all have in common. I think the one big question here, which was kind of alluded to earlier, is where is the UN Security Council in all of this? China, when the genocide happened in 2017, China used its veto power in the backroom negotiations to block, to stall, to avoid any kind of accountability for the regime in Myanmar. Well, that's just getting harder and harder as the evidence mounts, as the court rulings are starting to come out. And so I think it's now morally, politically, and also legally, the UN Security Council is obligated to make sure that these provisional measures are actually upheld, the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice, and they should uphold their responsibility to protect the Rohingya people.
Azim, Simon, as you heard, was talking about China, was talking about their veto at the UN Security Council and the fact that up until now that has seemed to protect Myanmar when it comes to investigations being launched. What do you think about this point? Will China continue to resolutely stand by Myanmar? Will there at some point be enough pressure put on the UN Security Council so that we will see them act in a deliberative way and actually try to punish Myanmar for the crimes committed against the Rohingya?
Well, China has stood by Myanmar throughout this entire period, and we must not forget that President Xi from China just visited Myanmar just days ago, signing more further deals, trade deals through the Belt and Road Initiative, putting in massive amounts of investment. The Rohingya crisis wasn't mentioned at all, simply because it doesn't feature on the radar. China is interested in Myanmar because it has aspirations to be a global superpower, but before it can become a global superpower, it must become a regional power, and that means keeping its regional nuclear rival India in check. Access to Myanmar gives it access to the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. Thus, they can avoid the Straits of Malacca. So China is calculating on a much higher geopolitical level. But being a superpower also carries significant responsibilities with it. And I certainly hope China comes to the realization that they simply cannot ignore international law, particularly when they themselves are relying on international law in many facets in the global community, particularly the trade war with the United States. So China has to become much more responsible, but so far they've just been nothing but a hindrance on the Security Council. How long they can do this and whether the Security Council can be bypassed and this case go directly to the Secretary General still remains to be seen, but that may be the only option.
Thomas, in the past week, in the lead up to the ruling today, I've been speaking with Rohingya refugees who I've come to know from the reporting trips that I took to Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. And they had been praying that they would get the ruling that they got today. And in the wake of the ruling, there was a lot of elation that was expressed on their part because of what had happened, thinking that this was opening a door so that they could finally be granted some justice. But at the same time, many of the same people that I speak with, they're still extremely worried. They're living in dire conditions. They are being fenced in more and more in those encampments in Cox's Bazar. So will what happened at the International Court of Justice have any effect on the conditions on the ground for those refugees who fled Myanmar and are now living in neighboring countries like Bangladesh?
Well, you can imagine how frustrating it is for the Rohingya now living in Bangladesh. They were routed from their own country by the military, who, could completely foresee the conditions in which they were going to have to live in. And they knew that many people had written books, written reports from academics to NGOs, explaining in detail the genocide process to which they have been suffering under. And frankly, I think a lot of people have been baffled about why the international community has done nothing about it up until now. And so this case will be welcomed by them because it makes it much more difficult for upstanding members of the international community to ignore what has happened to them. As for where do we go from here, they want to go home, they want to be repatriated, but they can't go back into the arms of the military who has just tried to destroy them. So it's a big problem, and that's probably the first thing the Security Council is going to have to look at. How do we repatriate this community, and how do we reintegrate it into society again? Because the rifts between the different ethnic groups now inside Rakhine State have gone on for years. And how do we provide them with security? So I think this is where we look at now. We can now ignore the denials from the Burmese government. We can ignore the denials from Aung San Suu Kyi. We now have it on record that there's a prima facie case to answer. And so we need to take steps now, like practical steps, to repatriate the Rohingya.
Simon, whenever these repatriation schemes that are entered into between Bangladesh and Myanmar, whenever they come up, and I speak to Rohingya refugees, they tell me they would love to go back home. But the key sticking point is always they don't have citizenship. They will not be granted citizenship. And this is not a point that Myanmar has ever relented on. They've never indicated that they would consider it. Does the ruling from the ICJ point in that direction, that perhaps at some point Myanmar could start relenting on this?
It doesn't resolve it, but it does point in that direction, as you just put it then. And as you would know from your own experience talking to Rohingya, you're absolutely right. People want to return home, but they want to return to safety and security. And at the moment, what we hear from Rohingya is return to what? They've been made stateless. They've been stripped of their citizenship. They essentially have no civil and legal rights in Myanmar. About 120,000 Rohingya who are still living in northern Rakhine State are actually segregated from the rest of the population and are living in so-called displacement camps, which are really just basically concentration camps to keep them out of the way of the rest of the population. So this is not a situation that anybody wants to return to. And I think why today's order was very important was precisely because the Gambia, again, had laid out those kinds of conditions and said, we think that this is part of the ongoing genocide against the Rohingya people, and that this has to be changed in order for people to return and for this to stop. The provisional measures doesn't exactly solve that issue, but it puts a huge obligation now on Myanmar to actually show that they're trying to create real conditions to which people can return to in safety and security.
Azim, the Rohingya, the plight of the Rohingya has largely been ignored by the international community. Whenever I speak to aid workers in those camps, they say more often than not that they're not getting the funding that they need, that the donor countries aren't meeting their obligations. This just continues to get worse and worse and worse. Does the ruling from the ICJ shine enough of a light on this issue now that you think that we will start seeing more members of the international community trying to contribute to help the Rohingya?
Well, I think we should certainly hope so. The Rohingya, as you know, the camp that they occupy in Cox's Bazar is the largest refugee camp in the world. You're talking almost 1 million refugees living in mud and squalor. And none of these camps are designed to be permanent. The government of Bangladesh is very clear that they want the Rohingya to return as swiftly as possible, which at the moment doesn't seem likely, even though this ruling is certainly welcome. We have to understand that the Rohingya have really nothing to actually return to. When they were expelled from Myanmar, their villages were burnt down, they were bulldozed, all the evidence was destroyed, and Myanmar mined the border to make sure that none of the Rohingya can actually return. So this was a systematic and organised campaign to ensure that these people can never actually return. So it falls upon the international community now to look at this ruling and see that the direction it's going in. This is hopefully just the first step for the Rohingya in terms of getting justice. But the reality is that most of them simply want to go back home and enjoy equal rights in the country of their birth.
Thomas, where does this leave things now when it comes to Aung San Suu Kyi?
Aung San Suu Kyi is, I think, at the end of the road with her denial. She's been using her political capital that she built up over decades to deflect the international community away, to deflect their eyes away from what the Burmese military were doing. And she's done that quite successfully. And this was her kind of last gambit, going to the ICJ, representing her country herself in the final denial, the final blowout for her. And I think that's over now. I think that she can no longer be taken seriously by governments around the world in the denial of what's going on. There's now a legal obligation on every country in the world. The court today has said there's a serious risk, and that puts a legal obligation on everybody to prevent genocide. The conditions in Cox's Bazar are part of the Burmese military's plan to destroy the Rohingya. So everybody has to come together and do something about that now. There are, in my view, legal obligations on the entire community. And as for Aung San Suu Kyi, she now needs to be taken for what she is, a possible complicit in this whole business. And we can no longer countenance our own ambassadors just taking her at her word and allowing them to do internal investigations, which are complete whitewashes. I think we need to take a much more stronger stance.
All right, well, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much to all our guests, Thomas McManus, Azim Ibrahim, and Simon Adams. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.